What's up, guys? Welcome to our first, well, it's not our first macro lecture. This is like the first involved modeling one. Because last lecture we just kind of just learned a few definitions. This one, the rubber hits the road. So we're learning about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, I chose this background, which is about how frequently the word recession is being used in news articles. And you might notice that there was a big spike in the conversation right at the beginning of the COVID stuff. Then the world calmed down and it almost forgot about recessions until just the last few months. So if you're a graduating senior, you may be graduating into turbulent times, just so you know. Anyway, I'm not going to jump into whether or not this is a recession yet. Some economists who are more influential than me will make that call. There are good things about our economy now, and there are bad things about our economy now. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned, but there are still some silver linings. So I'm not going to doomsday you. I just wanted this because it's interesting. So let's talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. But first, start with the word aggregate. Aggregate just means a lot of stuff combined. So aggregate demand curve, for instance, if you want to think of it this way, imagine if you could find some way to combine all the demand curves into one big super demand curve. An aggregate supply, imagine you could combine all the supply curves in the whole economy into one super supply curve. It's basically what aggregate supply and aggregate demand are. What lessons are we going to try to get from this? After the lessons, I'll tell you how we kind of try to do it. But what do you learn from supply and demand? Well, when supply curves or demand curves move, we can predict changes in quantities and prices. Now, at a macro level, if we can somehow combine all the demand and all the supply, then that quantity is all the stuff. That's our GDP. So if the quantity is rising, that's our economy expanding and producing more stuff. And if the quantity in this model is falling, well, that's the economy slowing down and producing less and less. Recession. Okay. What about the prices? Well, if price goes up, or what do we call it when all the prices go up? That's inflation. And if all the prices go down, that's deflation. Yeah, let's talk about it. Aggregate demand is basically just GDP, C plus I plus G plus net exports. If the government changes its spending, that'll move aggregate demand. If consumers get more optimistic about the future, that'll change aggregate demand. If, whatever, there's a list of them. It'll be in some of the videos, it'll be in the book, but aggregate demand is basically just how much GDP are we expecting? How much stuff are people going to buy? So again, the quantity variable is GDP. The price variable is some sort of an aggregate price. If you want to think about it as being the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that's fine. It doesn't have to be that. It could be a couple others. For instance, there's one called a GDP deflator. I mean, we could get to a few of them. But we mentioned CPI last week, so just roll with that. It's some sort of an overall price measure. Not the price of any one good, but the price of a whole boatload of goods. And if this huge basket gets more expensive, that's aggregate prices going up, and that's inflation. Let's think about this now for just a minute. And maybe you want to draw this, maybe not, I don't know. Probably not, because most of my students don't care to draw, and they don't have to. But if you want to, let's just do a little exercise. Draw a supply and a demand curve. We won't worry about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand terminology yet. But how would you model the quantity and the price increasing? Which curve has to move and in which way? That's the aggregate demand curve increasing, right? If consumers want to buy more and more stuff, production will increase, so will the price. What if you wanted to model a decrease in quantity, but an increase in price? That's a decrease in supply. And likewise, decrease in demand is a decrease in quantity and price, and an increase in supply is an increase in quantity and decrease in price. Okay, we've played those games before. Those all apply to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. When we look at the X, where the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand meet each other, if you want to model a situation where the economy is doing really well, where GDP is crazy high and unemployment's crazy low, but there's also a lot of inflation. That's like the American economy in early 2022. How do you get that? You see high quantities, high prices. You probably get that when aggregate demand is really high relative to aggregate supply. Now, what would our model predict though? Well, as prices rise, what happens? Not just like the price of one thing, so you just go buy a different bag of chips, but like the price of everything has been going up this year a lot. I just saw a news article this morning, although by the time you see this, it'll be months ago. Target, like the store, posted its earnings statement for the second quarter of 2022, and they earned like 90% less profit than everyone was expecting. And this news article basically said it's because consumers are hiding from inflation and are changing their spending behavior. So we had this time period where aggregate demand was super high and people are spending tons of money and inflation starts kicking in. And what is that creating? The high prices then change our behavior again and make us spend less money, which starts hurting the companies. And what do? They're going to start laying people off. I don't know if Target's going to do that right now, but lots of companies are starting to lay people off. Dude, if you're on LinkedIn, it's funny, or it's not funny. It's like sad, but funny, interesting. I have seen so many recruiters on LinkedIn saying that they just got laid off. And why is that? Most of these companies realize hard times are coming and they're not going to be hiring a lot of new people. And so who's the first people they get to lay off? The people who get new people. The recruiters are the first ones I'm seeing in mass getting cut right now. That's just my anecdote. I don't know if that's actual data, but it's been interesting to see. Anyway, this framework, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, can explain where our economy is and where our economy is going. It's going to help us explain the business cycle. Now, there's a whole lengthy discussion about short run versus long run. I'm going to leave that for the technical videos, but I just really wanted to hammer the point that this model is here to explain the business cycle. Now, it will not be able to predict the next recession. It will not be able to predict the next boom. It explains it, which is a different deal. Okay. And the way it basically explains it is it says, hey, this thing changes. That moves aggregate demand or aggregate supply. What's the effect on the economy? So big events. Enter COVID-19. What happens? Well, the supply curve decreases because lots of businesses shut down or reduced their operation. And the aggregate demand curve also decreased because a lot of us couldn't spend our money. Like we, I don't know if it like literally decreased, but there were definitely pressures decreasing it. But a lot of us couldn't spend our money the way we usually do. And so savings actually increased quite a bit. So what happens when supply and demand both decrease? Quantity falls, prices just depend what happens on prices. Well, COVID hit, the economy tanked. We didn't see a lot of inflation. Inflation did get lower than usual, but whatever. So then the government starts printing lots of money. Right? The Federal Reserve pushes interest rates down. We'll learn about that near the end of the class. The federal government starts handing out tons of money by borrowing money. And these are things that increase aggregate demand. These are things that make more money flow into the economy and increases it. More GDP means more people working. More people working means a richer society with happier voters. And so we saw it when COVID happened. We knew that that meant probable recession. So what's the government do? Try to fight the recession by increasing aggregate demand. Now, it's always controversial how they should do it. Should it just be cash transfers to citizens? Should it be specific public works project like building new freeways or high-speed rail? The nitty-gritty details I can't get into, especially not in a remote class. Although they do make for fun debates in person. But in general, I'm just going to say if G goes up, GDP goes up. And arguably, that third round of stimulus, the economy had already bounced back. And so that third round probably contributed to our inflation by increasing aggregate demand past the point of stability to the point of creating inflation. We'll learn about that later, but I just think it's interesting. Anyway, I hope this is a helpful primer. So as you're learning about this model, short run of supply, long run supply, aggregate demand, it's going to feel kind of dry. But we're going to use this to not only explain the business cycle, but also to explain the result of government policies and why they do what they do. Why is the Fed pushing interest rates low? Why did the government change taxes and spending? Why does all this stuff matter? We're going to learn about it. Side note, this is Keynesian economics, which is the mainstream view. Most economists fall somewhere under the Keynesian umbrella. It's not the only view. If you want to go research other stuff, go ahead. But we'll dig into that more later. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, guys. Good luck. Happy econing. Don't forget to hit up those discussion forums. Peace out.